Hello and welcome to Miniature Addiction Club. My name's Lou and today I'm going to be making miniature versions of items from my art studio for my first ever YouTube collab. The lovely Leslie from Wellinrow Arts organised this project, and several other miniaturists have contributed, including Tiny Keyhole Minis, Whitley Debris, Crafts by Xander, and Bentley House Minis. So make sure you head over to all of the other channels to check out what we have all made. I will link all of the videos below for you to watch, so please go and check them out. The concept for this collab was to create a 12th scale messy art room, and I was inspired by my own messy art studio, so I decided to recreate some of my art supplies and equipment that I use. First up, I'm going to be making a miniature easel. This is a replica of my own Lyra easel, and to make it in miniature I took some rough measurements and divided them by 12 to get the correct scale that I needed. Then I cut some coffee stirrer sticks to the desired measurements. These worked well as they are longer than popsicle sticks and slightly narrower, so I only had to cut them to the length I needed. Next, I glued the frame of the easel together using tacky glue. And once the frame was assembled, I added the mast to the centre. Here I'm gluing two pieces together to make the tray, and I glued the ends of 3 coffee stirrers together to make the top rounded part of the easel that holds the canvas. I also added a little gold seed bead to the bottom of the tray to be the latch that allows you to adjust the height of the easel. And I attached another one to the top piece. Then I glued the tray to the easel. It was at this stage I realised the coffee stirrers were too thin and they were a bit flimsy and out of proportion from the side. So I ended up cutting all new pieces to stick to the frame I had already made, and I clamped them in place with some bulldog clips while the glue dried. Then I cut off the excess wood and was left with a much sturdier frame. I made a miniature canvas as well, and I used this to determine where I needed to glue the top of the easel. To make the stand, I glued 2 coffee stirrers together and attached a metal hinge to the top. Before attaching the stand, I stained both pieces with some watered down walnut ink. I also added a layer of satin varnish to make it look as though the wood had been oiled. Once all the pieces were dry, I could then attach the back piece. To add some character to the easel, I added some paint splatters in various colours. This part was really fun, as I'm usually such a perfectionist that I would never let my own easel get so messy, but I really let loose on this miniature version. I even started adding red paint splatters before I quickly realised that it no longer looked like paint and looked more like something out of a horror movie, so I quickly covered that up with more paint. I also drilled a small hole in the front of the frame and the back piece so that I could thread some cotton string through and connect the two pieces, which stopped it from falling over. I tied a knot in the front, cut off the excess, and tied a knot in the back as well. I stained the string with the same walnut ink I used on the wood, just to tone it down a little. And there we have the finished easel. The next item I'm going to be making is a miniature version of my tin of sewing threads. It's customary where I live to use an old biscuit tin to store your sewing threads, which is exactly what this tin was originally. I took some photographs of the tin and adjusted them in Photoshop before printing out the images. Then I cut out the pieces and glued them to some cardstock. To make the base for the tin, I cut a circle out of some cardstock, leaving some extra card around the outside edge. And I cut little triangles along this border, which I could then fold over. I added some tacky glue to the folded edges, and then I glued the flat strip, which I pre-curled, to the circular rim of the base. I placed the base of the tin quite high so that I didn't have to fill up too much empty space inside. One thing I wish I had done beforehand is seal all of the printed paper with Mod Podge before I started assembling this piece, as some of the ink wore away with all of the handling, so I definitely recommend doing that first. To reinforce the tin, I added a thick layer of glue to the inside. To make the lid, I cut a slightly larger circle than I did for the base, and I cut the same triangles along the outside so I could fold over the edges. Then I took the thin strip I printed for the lip of the tin and glued that to the folded edges of the lid. Once that was dry, I added some glue to the top and added the cut-out printed image of the top of the tin. Here's how it's looking so far. Next, I'm adding some pewter coloured acrylic paint to the inside of the tin to make it look like it's made of metal. While the paint was drying, I moved on to making some tiny spools of thread to go inside the tin. I cut the ends off of a cotton swab and gently cut down the middle of the paper section. Then I could carefully unroll the paper to create a smaller paper roll. Then I cut some small sections to make the cotton reels. You could also make these out of toothpicks if you wanted to, and either leave them wooden or paint them. Next, I wrapped a cotton thread around each of the cotton reels and used a dot of glue to stop the thread from unraveling. To fill up the tin, I coated the inside with some tacky glue and added some small pieces of ribbon. Then I went ahead and added a bunch of tangled up threads to recreate the messy chaos that's currently inside my life-size sewing tin. I love how these tiny threads turned out, they're so cute. I glued each of them in place with tacky glue. You could keep the lid separate so it can be removed, but I decided to glue the lid off to one side, as though it had been pushed off in a hurry while someone was rummaging around looking for something and not put back on. I'm really happy with how this piece turned out. Let me know in the comments your favourite item from this video. I would love to hear your thoughts. Next up, I'm making some of my go-to art supplies, some bottles of Mod Podge and UV resin. To make the bottles of Mod Podge, I rolled out a snake of polymer clay. I used the edge of a palette knife and my dotting tool to create the cap and added some ridges to the cap section. I did the same with a slightly thicker snake of clay to create a different size bottle. To make a small bottle of UV resin, I rolled out some black clay into a thin slab. I cut out a small rectangle and rounded each of the corners with my fingers. For the lid, I flattened out a small ball of clay to make a circle and added a cone shape for the cap. I attached this to the bottle and set it aside. Next, I made some small blocks of Sculpey Primo by cutting small rectangles from various colours of polymer clay. Then I baked all of the pieces according to the instructions. Then I cut out some of the labels I printed and used tacky glue to stick them to the bottles. and then I went ahead and glued the labels to the other bottles. Even after years of making miniatures, I'm still somehow surprised every time by just how cute miniature things are. Next, I glued the tiny labels to the miniature packets of polymer clay and sealed everything with a gloss varnish. To make some miniature dollhouse magazines, I printed some scaled down covers and glued them to some folded paper. These are super easy to make, and I thought they would make a great addition to the room. To make the cutting mat, I printed out a generic picture I found, then glued it down to some grey cardstock, as they usually have a grey or black layer on the inside. Then I cut out the board with my scissors, rounding the corners slightly. This was very simple to make and it looked super cute, but it was still a little bit too pristine. So I roughed it up a bit by cutting the surface with my craft knife. The next item I'm making is a little sign that hangs in my studio. This used to belong to my grandma, and now it hangs in my studio, and I just love how it reminds me of her. It says, "My idea of cleaning is sweeping the room with a glance," and that pretty much sums up how I clean my room, and I thought it would be perfect for the messy art room project as well. To make it in miniature, I printed out a photo of the sign and glued it to some cardboard before cutting it out. It was quite hard cutting out the curved shape of the heart, so I ended up sanding the edges to smooth it out. Then I painted the back and sides of the cardboard and attached a little string to hang it with. Next, I'm making a jar of dirty paint water. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this sort of thing, and unfortunately have probably also either washed your paintbrush in your coffee or taken a sip of paint water. I'm using these clear plastic tubes that protect the end of paintbrushes to make the jar itself. I cut 2 pieces, one slightly shorter than the other, and one tube has a smaller diameter so it slots easily into the other, which created the neck of the jar. Then I attached the tubes to a piece of plastic sheet using UV resin to form the bottom of the jar. Once that was set, I trimmed off the excess plastic and sanded it smooth. To make the rim of the jar, I coated the top in some UV resin and set it with the UV light. Sorry my hands are in the way whilst I was filming this clip and you can't really see what I'm doing. I also decided to make a paintbrush to put in the jar. To do this, I'm using the end of a toothpick and just shaving off some of the thickness to make it smaller, and I'm sanding it smooth as well. You can see the difference here between the regular toothpick on the left. Next, I plundered some fur from my dog to make the bristles of the brush. Don't worry, no animals were harmed, it's shedding season and her fur falls out in clumps, so I had an abundance of this free resource. I really hope Leslie isn't allergic to dogs. I trimmed the tuft of fur and applied some glue to the end with a toothpick. Once that was dry, I trimmed off the excess glue and stuck it to the brush handle. To make the metal ferrule of the brush, I cut a strip of foil, covered it in glue and wrapped it around the bristles. Once it was dry, I cut off the excess foil and trimmed the bristles to form a point. I also added some watered down glue to keep the bristles in place. I love how the brush turned out, but spoiler alert, I'm about to ruin it in just a moment. I added some UV resin to the jar and mixed in some ink to colour the water. Even though I added it gradually, I still somehow ended up adding too much ink and you can't really see any of the details of the paintbrush. I did end up making a couple more brushes, but they didn't turn out as nice as my first one. I also went ahead and added some watered down acrylic paint to the lip of the jar and to the handle of the brush. And here are all of the finished items. I just want to say thank you to all of you watching and a huge welcome to all of my new subscribers. I I was very worried that my miniatures were lost in the post as they took over 2 months to finally get to Leslie, but I am on the other side of the world, so I suppose that is to be expected. I am so glad that they arrived safely, and I'd like to thank Leslie again for organising this collaboration. I am truly grateful for all of the friends I have made in this miniature community, and it just keeps growing, so thank you everyone for being part of my new happy place. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.